Tarzan has never felt the grass beneath his feet. He has never swum, never known the freedom of running wherever he wants, when he wants. He has only known a tiny cage on the back of a lorry and being forced to perform circus tricks to entertain people. But all that is about to change. After almost 24 hours in a transport crate, Tarzan has reached the Animal Defenders International Rescue Centre in South Africa. For Tarzan, it has been just another day, confined in a small barren crate and on the move. Little does he know that today he will walk free. Tarzan owes these first steps to freedom to Animal Defenders International, known as ADI, an animal protection group with offices in the UK and USA working worldwide to protect animals. As the stories of the animals in the ADI Rescue Centre reveal, this is an organisation whose rescues are inseparably linked to effective public education and lobbying campaigns that have influenced governments, international treaties and educational establishments. ADI field officers work undercover, deep inside the murky world of industries where animal abuse occurs, to secure evidence and bring the perpetrators to justice. Bringing about long-term change is the aim, but along the way, ADI offers hope to animals in crisis where there seems none, a way out against all the odds. Like Toto, the chimpanzee, forced to smoke cigarettes and live in a packing crate with a circus in Chile, who made it home to Africa. Like Darwin, the monkey tormented in laboratory experiments, who somehow made it out alive. And Tarzan, taking these first, slightly unsteady steps to freedom. As a rather bewildered Tarzan settles down in the sunshine, his new neighbours, tigresses Mowgli and Shere Khan, watch him with interest. These two grand old ladies, sometimes perhaps a little unkindly referred to as the grumpy old ladies, have been in the care of ADI for over a decade since their rescue. Now in the region of 18 years old, they look on, fascinated but cautious, as young Tarzan emerges into the sunlight in his enclosure. Their story began in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, over a decade earlier. Notorious throughout Africa as a suspected front for animal trafficking, the Akef Egyptian circus had rolled into Maputo at the end of a long tour, crossing many borders. The owner left, saying he was going to arrange passage back to Egypt, leaving both animals and circus workers stranded. The workers ran out of money and food. The lions, tigers, horses, dogs and snake began to starve, and one of the tigers, Raj, died. A local woman, Mrs. Eleanor Sun, fed the animals and put out an international call for help. Her determination changed their fate.
That the horses are dying, the mother hasn't got milk, and the baby's going to die within 24 hours.
The plea reached ADI, London. Calls were put into the Global Secretariat of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, in Switzerland, to the government of Mozambique and to the government of South Africa, requesting CITES permits to move the animals out of Maputo into the permanent care of ADI. A temporary refuge was confirmed with Mrs. Lenta Ruder of the Hoedspruit Endangered Species Centre. While these negotiations were underway, an ADI rescue team left for Mozambique within days of the call for help. horses were pitifully thin. The mare had given birth in Maputo, but her milk had dried up. The dogs were in a tiny cage, but were reasonably healthy. A single African python remained, even though the circus had previously had 4, and the 6 lions and 3 tigers were in tiny cages. But getting the animals would not be simple. The circus's creditors did not want to see it leave without paying its debts and threatened to kill the animals and anyone helping them. The tigers were worth more dead than alive. ADI secured the site with a local security firm and began feeding and vaccinating the animals, but were disrupted by the arrival of nightclub and landowner Alex Barbosa, colourfully presented by locals as the neighbourhood gangster, who owned the land the circus had rented. A standoff with ADI Chief Executive Jan Creamer allowed time for the animals to be vaccinated. This was followed by a bizarre and lengthy negotiation in semi-darkness in front of the animals' cages. The following days were punctuated by attempts to block the rescue. A fistfight broke out between circus workers, divided between those prepared to assist the rescue and those opposing it. The owner, Akef, claimed he was on his way back, but the rescue pressed on. The horses, Butterscotch, Amber and Tigger, were moved to a local riding school. Within 4 days of arriving, the rescue was at full speed and paperwork was being frantically completed to export the animals into South Africa. The animals were prepared, but hours ticked by, waiting for a crane. Then, as it arrived, hopes were dashed. The South African authorities had rejected some of the paperwork. The move was off. The animals had come so close, but now it was beginning to look hopeless. How could ADI get them out before Akef or someone else tried to claim them? But Akef didn't show. 2 days later, with permits in place, the ADI team were warned by a government official that if the animals were not out of Maputo before the city started work the next day, it would all be over. Time to get out of town. As the sun rose, the ADI team were overseeing the dismantling of the circus site and loading of the animals. The lions and tigers would make one last journey in their transport container. The python was loaded into a box sealed with a mosquito net, and the dogs were put in their usual travelling cages. By 7 a.m, the lion and tiger cage was being loaded by crane. A crane and lorry had been kept concealed in a nearby town for 2 days in order to avoid attempts to thwart the rescue. The animals would be in jeopardy until they crossed the border, and tension rose as this approached. However, although the convoy created a stir, the paperwork was in order. The ADI convoy was allowed through to South Africa and safety. The dogs were handed to the waiting SPCA for quarantine and rehoming. The snake, Murphy, would be transferred to a snake park. The lions and tigers were given water and then sprayed with insecticide. The journey through the mountains to freedom resumed. Hours later, as darkness fell, we pulled into the Hoedspruit Endangered Species Centre, HESC. With its expertise in African wildlife, on-site quarantine and state-of-the-art veterinary facilities, Lenteruda's HESC was the ideal temporary refuge. Little did we all know that this night was destined to mark the beginning of a long relationship helping animals in need, eventually establishing the ADI Rescue Centre. For now, this would be the last night the cats would spend inside their bleak beast wagon. At daybreak, HESC vet Peter Rogers darted each animal and they were carried to the surgery for a battery of health checks and insect repellent. All were anemic with low blood pressure. Through our lawyers in Johannesburg, ADI instigated an adoption process that would ensure safe permanent homes for the big cats. Unfortunately, the tiger's uncertain genetic background and health status meant that no programs in India could take them. One application that we refused was subsequently exposed for canned hunting in an ADI-assisted investigation. 3 of the lions, renamed Goldie, Blondie and Shorty, were the first to be homed to the nearby Maholo Hollow Wildlife Rehabilitation Centre. In accordance with ADI's wishes, the 3 lions and the male tiger were given vasectomies when they were anaesthetised for the move to prevent future breeding. There was already a shortage of homes and habitat. Still unconscious, the lions were loaded onto open trucks, driven to Maholo Hollow and finally laid unconscious in their sleeping quarters. They would be released the following morning to a life full of the richness of natural experiences in their large but well-protected enclosures. It is deeply moving to see an animal that has endured so much take its first steps to freedom, a sometimes bewildered look, melting into confidence. One by one, the mighty lions headed into their new kingdoms, large enclosures of rich natural bush to explore. ADI's favoured solution for the 3 tigers had been to find a place where they could return to their natural habitat, but in a protected environment. With this not being possible, a home that could create a suitable habitat had to be found. Following negotiation and a site inspection, in the company of 2 inquisitive ostriches, a new enclosure was constructed for the tigers at a game lodge in KwaZulu-Natal. It was decided to transport our precious cargo during the cool of the night. They were anaesthetised, given health checks, and loaded into their travel crates. And at 11 p.m, the convoy left Hoedspruit in a fierce thunderstorm. On arrival the next morning, the tigers were released into their observation quarters, where they looked out with an air of inquisitive nervousness onto the land that would become home. As they emerged into their new home, which included a pool, a cave, and natural bush vegetation, the ripples about their rescue began to spread across the globe. It had revealed weaknesses in the international CITES regulations for cross-border movements of circus animals. These had been exploited by the Akef Egyptian circus, which had obtained suspect permits for a variety of species during their tour of Africa. ADI began campaigning at CITES for a system of animal passports. Nearly 6 years later, new rules for the cross-border movement of endangered species with travelling exhibitions were introduced in all 170 CITES countries, with almost all of the ADI recommendations adopted. It had been noticed that 1 male lion, Akef, and 2 females possessed the distinctive characteristics of the extinct-listed Barbary subspecies. Professor David Meltzer of Pretoria University, Veterinary faculty, investigated this, and ADI subsequently agreed that these animals could be released into a natural bush enclosure at HESC to give them a chance to breed and provide offspring, which could be reintroduced to the wild. Barbary lion numbers began to drop as the ancient Romans trapped them for fighting in their arenas. Later, as communities north of the Sahara increased, rewards were offered to kill the predators to stop them taking livestock. Others were snatched for European circuses and zoos. Finally, in 1920, the last wild Barbary lion was shot by a hunter in Morocco, and the subspecies were deleted from the World Encyclopedia of Animals. Now called Ippy, Madonna and Sharon, the Barbary lions were anaesthetised and carried by lamplight one night to their new home. In the morning, the ADI team were greeted by a wonderful sight. One of the lionesses stretched across a dirt track, basking in the morning sun. Ippy was in a cage, whilst Sharon, the lioness, was lying just outside. The door was released and out he strode, proudly surveying his surroundings and inspecting the vehicles. Through lack of data, DNA testing could not confirm their Barbary heritage, And despite ADI rescuing similar lions from Italy that could also join the project, the lions did not breed. A year and a half after the release, Madonna had a miscarriage and later died. Sadly, life with the circus had probably taken its toll. Ippy and Sharon were inseparable from the day she waited outside his cage, and they roamed their huge estate for 8 wonderful years. When Sharon finally died of old age, the HESC staff feared that the elderly Ippy would not cope alone, and within 2 months he too passed away. Meanwhile, life moved on in the African bush for the rescued tigers. After several years of freedom, the male tiger passed away, but the females marched on towards old age. The care of the tigers was handed over to Ken and Lois Kuhuli, who turned the establishment into the Milimani Game Sanctuary. In the following years, they released over 270 indigenous animals back into the wild and became the first official release site for tortoises in South Africa. However, almost a decade after the rescue, the sanctuary became the target of a successful land claim, a legal action to redistribute South African land with compensation. Lois and Ken had to look for a new place for themselves and the tigers. Tragically, just weeks before they were due to leave the property, Ken had a sudden heart attack and died. ADI asked HESC to provide refuge for the tigers again, and they were offered a permanent home with ADI funding their care. The move would also reunite the tigers with ADI campaigns director Tim Phillips, who'd been part of the original Mozambique rescue, and Professor David Meltzer, who'd identified the Barbary features and is now the HESC veterinary director. Although fit, Mowgli and Shere Khan were now elderly ladies, and so extra care was needed with the anaesthesia required to load them. One tiger was darted and carried unconscious to her travelling crate. She was then given an antidote, and as she came around, the crate was closed. Only as she regained consciousness was the second tiger darted and loaded. As the tigers stirred in their crates, the long journey back to Hoedspruit began, with stops every hour to check the animals were okay, finally arriving at dusk. One at a time, the doors were carefully raised, and out stepped the still groggy tigers into their new home. As the sun set, another chapter opened in the remarkable lives of Mowgli and Shere Khan. The following morning found them tucking heartily into their breakfast. Relocation successful. Having instigated new rules on cross-border movement of CITES-listed species, our 2 old lady tigers, without knowing it, now set in motion plans for a permanent safe haven for animals rescued by ADI. A year and a half later, the grumpy old ladies were watching with great curiosity as a crate was hauled into position in the next enclosure along, and out stepped Tarzan. As Tarzan took his first steps into the sunlight, his journey there had been no less dramatic than his neighbours, and had started with a search for a polar bear. The world's largest land predator, polar bears are built for a life on the Arctic wastes. They can run up to 35 miles per hour, travel for miles each day, and their partially webbed feet enable them to swim for more than 60 miles without rest. If anything could be further from their natural life, it would have to be the travelling circus. So when the ADI office was contacted with news that a circus was visiting the tourist hotspots in Portugal with a polar bear, ADI field officers were quickly dispatched. Stripped of all dignity, and with an inadequate domestic fan against the sweltering sun, the bear was clearly suffering. Legal action to seize the bear was thwarted when the circus disappeared, possibly slipping into Spain. but ADI determined to tackle the Portuguese circus industry. A year later, a team of ADI field officers were working undercover and gathering evidence of animal suffering in circuses as they toured Portugal. A new Portuguese DVD and report showing the evidence of animal suffering and brutality were then launched at a press conference in Lisbon as part of ADI's global Stop Circus Suffering campaign. So when, sometime later, news broke that 2 lions and 2 tigers had been abandoned at the roadside in Palmela by a circus, ADI were quickly contacted. An ADI field officer discovered that, contrary to rumour, the animals were still owned by Circo Universal, which was temporarily off the road due to lack of funds. There were 2 lions, Caesar and Sarah, and 2 tigers, Royale and Tarzan, living in rusting cages on the back of a lorry. The authorities were contacted, and an ADI vet, together with a local vet, checked their health and vaccinated the animals, followed by a meal with a dose of mineral supplements. Motivated by the ADI action, the Portuguese authorities seized the animals almost immediately afterwards and agreed to hand them over to ADI as soon as permits were granted for a move to South Africa. The animals were put in holding facilities at the Lisbon Zoo, where access to the 4 animals was even denied to the ADI veterinary team, making planning and preparations difficult. Finally, after a series of agonising delays, import and export permits were granted, and ADI began the final preparations for the move. As these progressed, with just 2 weeks to go, tragedy struck. The zoo reported that the female tiger, Royale, had suddenly died. ADI knows that these animals can be broken by the lives they lead, be it abuse, lack of appropriate care and diet, the health impact of severe confinement. Poor Royale would never taste freedom. 2 weeks later, Tarzan, Caesar and Sarah were driven from the zoo and finally handed into ADI's care at Lisbon Airport. PBS International Freight and Neotrans helped facilitate the transfer at the airport, providing a controlled area to check the animals. TAP Air Portugal provided discounted flights for the animals and smoothed our journey through pre-flight checks. A brief press conference was held nearby as our veterinary team checks the animals. We highlight the plight of circus animals in Portugal and call for government action. Caesar has no mane because he's been castrated, but he is an unusually tall lion. Both lions made it clear that, understandably, they do not care for the human race. They launch themselves at anyone who comes close. Tarzan the tiger, on the other hand, is relaxed and calm, rolling on his back inside his travel crate. He even posed for a few photographs before being closed in for the journey to South Africa. Finally, it is time to load the animals and head into the sunset, leaving behind all the last-minute anxieties, such as when the Portuguese authorities could not decide who should issue the export permits, jeopardising the rescue. The following morning, we touched down in Johannesburg. Vet David Meltzer waits to check the animals as soon as they're unloaded. It is always a tense time, waiting to see how animals have fared. To everyone's relief, they're looking lively and are transferred to the customs area. The first task is to open the crates and confirm there are no problems. Tarzan is still completely laid back and apparently quite unfazed by the ordeal. Caesar and Sarah are more agitated and even a little aggressive towards their rescuers, so it's careful with the fingers when opening the cage. Whilst the animals are given water and paperwork is completed, another press conference is held nearby. Back in the UK, ADI supporter and actress Samantha Janus is appearing on breakfast television, so the story of these lucky animals, as well as the issue of animal circuses, is being aired on national media in 3 different countries. The cats' crates are carefully loaded onto a transporter for the 260-mile journey to our final destination. The biggest concern is the heat. But the crates have been painted a reflective white and are well ventilated, so air will be forced through the crates while on the road. Nevertheless, a long journey with regular water stops. We arrive at Hoedspruit in the late afternoon. The lions are unloaded, ready for release into a holding pen. Sarah's crate is opened first. Clearly intrigued by the people who have moved her, she's facing the wrong way, but turns and takes refuge in the sleeping quarters. Caesar is next. He's very quick off the mark, dipping down and surging out of the crate even before the door is fully open. He dashes straight into the sleeping quarters. He and Sarah are clearly very pleased to see each other and appear to take some comfort from each other's presence. And now it is Tarzan's turn to take his first steps into the sunshine. His neighbours, the two grumpy old ladies, Shere Khan and Mowgli, watch his exit from his travelling crate with interest. But what of the other three lions from the Mozambique rescue? Sadly, Goldie passed away from old age after 2 precious years of freedom. But as Tarzan makes his entrance to the new ADI rescue centre, Blondie and Shorty are still living happily just a few miles away at Maholo Hollow, 11 years on from their dramatic rescue. Shorty is now very old, but he keeps defying the odds and soldiering on, but finally passes away a few months later. Blondie is remarkable, seeming to have aged little since the rescue. Life at Maholo Hollow has clearly been good to him. Sometime after the Mozambique rescue, the circus owner called ADI to threaten legal action to get the animals back. Chief Executive Jan Creamer told him that not only would ADI see him in court, but would counter-sue for the cost of the animals' care and their relocation. We did not hear from him again. Meanwhile, a few miles from Maholo Hollow at the ADI Rescue Centre, Tarzan settles down in the shade, perhaps not realising that the good life has just begun. The following day, Tarzan is slowly exploring his enclosure and the lions are enjoying breakfast. All seems well so far. However, the next day there is a problem. Tarzan is intrigued at the sight of the female tigers in the distance, possibly even thinking it was his cage mate, Royale. He tries to get to them under the fence. The grumpy old ladies are appalled and have run away and hidden in the rocks. Tarzan has to be sedated and taken to a quarantine pen while plans are made for rearranging the enclosures. Poor Tarzan is banged up. Changes are made to his enclosure to prevent a repeat episode, and Tarzan returns to the good life. Now it is time for the lions to see the African countryside. Caesar and Sarah are released into their new home. Following their life in the circus, these animals can never be released into the wild. They have lived with humans, and they cannot fend for themselves. So we give them a protected environment with as much freedom as possible. If ever an image confirmed how wrong it is to keep animals confined in cages on the backs of lorries, surely it is this one. The two lions seem remarkably well suited and are playful and affectionate. Caesar towers over Sarah, but they seem to have a genuine bond. ADI is committed to caring for all of these animals for the remainder of their days, keeping them fed, providing veterinary attention, and ensuring that they are safe. Sadly, during the course of making this film, dear grumpy old Mowgli passed away. She was thought to be at least 18 years old and enjoyed more than half of that life free from the misery of the circus, a precious gift from supporters of ADI. She even helped us to change the world for other animals. Shere Khan is now frail, but remains alert and quick on her feet. She was always the more reclusive of the two and tucks herself away for much of the time. Unlike her exhibitionist neighbour, Tarzan, who greets anyone passing by. But don't be fooled by the casual demeanour. He's still a top predator who recently killed a vulture that took one too many liberties in his enclosure. Monday morning, and the cats are all excited by the approach of the meat truck. They're fed 3 times a week and are soon tucking in, with Caesar and Sarah carrying their food into the bush. Feeding time also provides an opportunity for enclosure maintenance and other checks. Regular steps are taken to keep the animals free of parasites. Many viewers will have struggled putting flea drops on a domestic cat. Now scale up the problem. However, it goes smoothly, and the cats are soon returning to their enclosures. For as little as £4 or $8 a month, ADI supporters can adopt the animals rescued by ADI, helping us to pay for their care for many years. Our adoption scheme also enables us to plan ahead for other rescues. Call or email our office for details. Today, Caesar and Sarah will walk, run, rest and play in their piece of the African bush. Like Ippy and Sharon before them, they will be able to grow old together, back where they belong, king and queen of all they survey.